So I am happy to present Mark Cabaj, and Mark will be sharing today a lot of the learnings and insights and tools that he has been a part of developing and utilizing to really support change in communities, working alongside communities and organizations. Mark is the president of From Here to There consulting company and an associate of the Tamarack Institute for Community Engagement. So Mark, without further ado, I'd like to bring you on up to be able to share with us here today.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me out. How's the sound, everyone? Is it okay? So, and if it's not, just throw up your hands. Sometimes I drift from the mic a little bit. It's always good to start off with a report on one's physical condition. So I just want to let you know, I went to the gym 2 days ago after 3 years, and I was doing some squats, and I can barely move. So I'm not having a stroke. I'm not going to keel over, but I look pretty odd walking. So just so you don't worry, just so you can focus on the presentation. So thank you for inviting me. I am happy to be here for a bunch of reasons. Number one, I like the Santa Goretti Center quite a bit. I love the way the community takes care of this hall and how many people use it, and when people use it, how well they take care of us. So it is fun to come to this place. I kind of feel like I'm visiting cousins. Number two, I follow the work that you do a little bit. In fact, I was engaged a little bit with some of this work a long time ago when Rick Curtis was the head of Alberta Recs and Parks Association, and Damien was there, and some of you remember that. So I'm familiar with the work you do. Number three, I do like going to rooms where of change makers. So I like the focus of this conference. And for me, a change maker is someone who wants to shape the future, not endure it. You feel like you can shape things, not endure them, and it's fun to be in the room with people like that. And number four, it's another occasion to share some perspectives on community building and change making that we have seen over the many years at the Tamarack Institute. I used to be the vice president of the Tamarack Institute, and before that I worked overseas. And our job was to watch how change makers were making change, to look for patterns and themes, and to feed that back to people. And given the conversations we had in preparation of this, we thought it might be good to talk a little bit about how taking on a complexity perspective can assist with your change-making efforts. So today, the storyline is complexity, looking through the world through the lens of complexity, and some aids for action that can assist with that. So, by the way, Ben set me up a little bit. I talked to Ben. Who was here and heard Ben yesterday? Okay, so Ben was talking a bit about evaluation. I do a lot of evaluation, but we're not going to talk a ton or much about evaluation today. Although the stuff that I share with you, I find often comes up in evaluation, and in fact, the evaluation shows that maybe we should have some of these foundational perspectives in play to make the work even easier. So this often turns up in evaluation downstream, and the insight is maybe we should pay more attention to this upstream. Now, if you're interested in any of this, the website is on there, heretothereconsulting.ca. There's a huge section on resources. A lot of it's around evaluation, but today's not so much about evaluation. It's about a complexity perspective on looking at change making in general. So we have a 1-hour mission. We have till 10:15, correct? Yep. So the 1-hour mission is I'm going to introduce you to 2 aids for action, and I'm going to talk I'll share why I use that phrase shortly, that you already have either, I think, on your desk, or you'll have electronic access to, something called the Agreement Certainty Matrix, which we'll play with right away, and I think you're going to play with this afternoon, which is not my tool. It's one that we've used, that I've adapted a bit. And then another one that I felt I had to create because it wasn't created before, and it's a work in progress, but it's called the Strategy Continuum. Oh, they're in your gray bags. Okay. So thank you very much for that. So what this is going to be is I'm almost going to get. You ever seen a cooking show where they kind of muck around a little bit with the recipe, and then they say, well, we don't have time to finish it, but look what it looks like when you pull it out of the oven. We're kind of going to do that. I'm going to give you a real quick summary with some anecdotes about how they're used, about how I use these tools, and you're going to just determine whether or not they're useful for you. You will make that choice yourself. But here is why I think that. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes on context, and then we're going to go into those other 2 aids, and I'm going to present, give you a little bit of time to chat, and then we'll have some more time to chat at the very end. But why why take a complexity perspective? Here's a riddle that some of you have heard before, or it's not a riddle, it's a story that is a good kind of a metaphor for why I think it's important. Jane and Bob are walking home Jane's walking home and she sees this fellow Bob in the parking lot. It's at night. And he's on his hands and knees around a big light in the parking lot, looking for something, clearly looking for something. And he's looking for quite a long time. She's watching him. So at one point she walks over and says, "Listen, Bob," of course, you can insert any name that you like. "What are you doing?" He goes, "I'm looking for my car keys." And she goes, "Well, I'll help." So she gets down on her hands and knees and she starts to look. And they're looking and looking. It's taking quite some time. And they've gone around the same area of ground several times over. And she said, "Listen, they don't seem to be here. Where did you lose them again? Like, can you remember that?" And he said, "Oh," and he stands up and brushes off his pants and he goes, I lost them out there." And he points to a dark side of the parking lot, away from the light. And she says, "Well, why are you looking here?" And he says, "There's way more light over here." Oh, you're a tough crowd. That's a good joke. So here's what I like about that. I think a lot of the way we deal with complex issues in our community is we treat them as if they're simple or complicated problems. And we're going to get into that right away, where there is a recipe or an expert can solve them. And we train people that way, we fund people that way, we ask them to put in grant proposals that way, we manage that way, we evaluate that way for simple and complicated stuff. And when things are simple and complicated, that works, and we're going to get into what that means. But complex things aren't solved that way. They're not solved that way, regardless of whether we want to work that way. They're different. They are in the dark side of the parking lot. And we actually have to find out new ways to go find our car keys to solve, to make progress on our complex issues. Now let me play with that a little bit more. I'm actually going to, here's a riddle. Some of you know this riddle because you've read it in the book called Getting to Maybe, which if you haven't read the book Getting to Maybe, it came out in 2004, 2005. It's in some chapter stores, but for sure on Amazon or Indigo, etc. It is a great, great book. It's all about what it takes to innovate on complex problems. And it's just full of stories of innovators told by three people, Brenda Zimmerman, Francis Wesley, and Michael Quinn Patton. But this is Brenda Zimmerman's riddle, and some of you already know this, so I won't put you in groups. Let's just do it together as a team. What's the difference between baking a cake, sending a rocket to the moon, and raising a child? Baking a cake? Baking a cake, in fact, if we had more time, I'd let you play with this, because actually the responses are quite good. Here's the way that Brenda Zimmerman answers this question. Baking a cake is simple. If you follow the recipe, and you follow it with high fidelity, and it's a good recipe, you should, with some degree of predictability, produce a good cake. I'm the exception to the rule, but you get it? It's recipe-like. Find the right recipe. That's different than sending a rocket to the moon. A rocket to the moon can't be done by a recipe, but if you have experts who have lots of experience and they pool together their expertise and they put together these complicated, science-based things, experts can actually send a rocket to the moon if they're following their own formulas with some high degree of predictability. Doesn't guarantee, but expertise is required. So we couldn't do it. Right? Even if someone showed us the recipe for sending a rocket to the moon, we don't have the level of expertise and the machinery behind us to be able to do it. Raising a child is not simple, like baking a cake. It's not complicated, like sending a rocket to the moon, which requires expertise. It is complex. Who has kids? Who has a strategic plan for their kids? Almost everyone says, and then you say, how's it going? Why don't you have a plan? How come you don't have plans for your kids? I mean, you have plans, but a strategic plan and a model and a recipe. How come you don't have recipes and experts raising your kids? Kids have free will, right? Kids have free will, so how do you respond to kids? How do you respond to raising kids? I mean, I've got two. I still don't know what I'm doing. I'm trying hard. You pay attention to what other people are doing, you experiment a little bit, you zoom out and you try and understand your own principles and what are important to you, and you develop patterns over time that seem to work. Sometimes we continue patterns that don't work. Who's actually experienced raising kids in a certain way for a certain time and all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore? Right? How come? They change, the context changes, you change, right? I'm the oldest of 6 kids. I grew up in St. Paul. I'm the oldest of 6 kids. My brother was born 22 years later than me. Same parents, but I was raised by Joseph and Ludmila Stalin. And my brother was raised by hippies, right? And why? And I asked my mom and she goes, oh, we were so tired by then. Like, so he was raised with benign neglect. Now that changes. Who's got more than 1 kid? Do you treat them the same? How come? Different personalities, different time, different context, right? When I was raised, there was no cell phone. When my brother, well, I guess not my brother, but my kids, there's cell phone dynamics now. Like, who knows how to deal with cell phone dynamics? They're brutal, actually. So, what do you do when you raise children as a complex thing? You have patterns, you have principles, you are highly adaptive. Context matters. There's no cookie cutter recipe. What works in one context doesn't work in another context. You're always probing, looking for productive patterns, and when they work, you back them up. Yeah? You go, oh, good, we found something. When they don't work, hopefully you back off and you try something else, and you try and do it earlier than later. You probably don't create grand plans that fail in implementation. Your style and how you resolve things emerges over time. Make sense? Hold on to that metaphor, because we're going to keep playing with it a little bit. I'm actually going to read this out loud, so I have to turn around. Here is a complex issue. This is from a book by David Shipler, and I love it because it's a great summary of what it's like to live with extreme vulnerability and the complexity of that. Every problem magnifies the impact of the others, and all are so tightly interlocked that one reversal can produce a chain reaction with results far distant from the original causes. A rundown apartment can exacerbate a child's asthma, which leads to a call for an ambulance, which generates a medical bill that cannot be paid, which ruins a credit record, which hikes the interest rate on a loan, which forces the purchase of an unreliable used car, which jeopardizes a mother's punctuality at work, which again limits her promotions and earning capacity, which again confines her to poor housing. So, tightly coupled, isn't it? Recipes going to solve this? Experts going to solve this by doing more homework? How about, in order to solve that unbelievably tough puzzle, it's going to have to be experimental, it's going to depend on context, we're going to have to think systemically about it. Simple and complicated ain't going to cut it. This is a complex issue. Now, I'm going to give you a quick example that I'm going to return to later. This is we used to run a poverty reduction network of collective impact efforts, and this happened in Surrey in 2006. 2006, a group agreed to tackle a complex issue, reducing the number of homeless day laborers in that area of Surrey. They wanted to tackle it, but they couldn't come up with a plan, A, because they didn't trust each other. They were service providers who hadn't spent a lot of time together. The social capital was low. They were intimidated about the prospects of coming up with a plan. So here's what they agreed to do, a very simple emergent process. They agreed that they were going to get a worm's eye view of what it was like to be a homeless day laborer in Surrey, and then they would zoom out and get a bird's eye response around changing the systems and policy that made people vulnerable in the first place. Zoom in, zoom out. So what's the first thing they did? They actually followed homeless day laborers, and they found out that a lot of them come home, they're working on construction sites because there's a boom for Vancouver for the Olympics going on. And I did this during school. You go to construction sites, you clean them up for the next day. You stay until 10 or 11 at night though. So they actually can't get into shelters because the shelters, what? Close their doors, number one. And the shelters, if you don't have welfare receipt, or at least if you didn't in Surrey in 2006, they would say you weren't eligible for access because they were working with the 40-year-old story that if you were working, you probably didn't need access to a shelter. They zoomed in. They zoomed out, called all the shelters together, and they said, hey, here's the problem. Would you change your policies? They said, yes. Boom, policy change, one meeting. They kept going, and they found out that homeless day laborers are working, and in fact, they're making $8 an hour back then, but the employment agencies that employ them are making $16 an hour. They get $16 an hour, or 18 and 9, and they give them 9. That's 50% of the rate. So they went, that was a worm's eye insight, bird's eye response. They had some success with the shelter, so they brought the temp agencies together and they said, would you change that? And the temp agency said, no. And we needed more data. And why did they say no? They showed us their books. And here is a paradox, or not even a paradox. It is a predatory business, temp agencies. It is predatory. It is also a crappy business. Even being predatory, they barely make money. I've seen those books. And so the issue is, well, if we do that, we're shutting down. So then they said, okay, we're not going to ask you to do that. But then they went to construction companies and they said, around homeless day laborers, would you go to the nonprofit sector who's already providing employment services and allow them to do the temp function? They won't charge you a rate. And they did. 75% of the construction companies did this. So check this out, anyone who's ever done employment programming, which I used to do. Within 2 or 3 weeks, the wages go from $8 an hour to $16 an hour, right? Wow. Systems change, right? Micro example. Then, like intervening into all complex problems, that generated another problem, unanticipated. You intervene into a complex issue, there's a splatter of outcomes. Most of them are anticipated. You don't even know what's going on. This whole idea that we're surgical about it, erase that image from your mind. You do something and then boom, something else happens. Unanticipated outcome, construction companies are saying, hey, I used to pay automatic deposit. And now I have to provide direct deposit. It's a pain in the butt because they don't have bank accounts. Now, how come they don't have bank accounts? They're homeless, right? So you need an address. So what do? They went to the big banks and they said, hey, would you actually help with create bank accounts? And the big banks said, no. Long story, but it's all in Toronto. It's too hard. I'd like to do it, but I got to get approvals from 17 different levels. It's not going to work. They went to the credit unions, including Van City and a bunch of other progressive ones, and they said, sure. They started creating alternative financial products for the working poor. I could keep going with this story because it does keep going, but you see what the metaphor is. They peel away the onion piece by piece. They understand that complexity piece by piece. Act, react, adapt. Act, react, adapt. Look for something that works. If it works, right, great. If it doesn't, you adapt. Over time, this thing actually developed a pattern where they started to say, this is no longer emergent. We actually know what's going on. So we have a program that is now comprised of patched income. How do you allow people to patch income from different sources? Access to housing. I didn't even tell you about the housing part of the story, but it runs along the same line. Access to shelter, etc. And they pulled all that together and they created a pilot program that eventually became an entire strategy. Strategy emerged through a process of trial and error. Strategy, in that case, also exhibited 3 key principles for dealing with complex issues. If no one person can solve the complexity of that woman's story alone or the complexity of homeless day laborers alone, you are unavoidably going to be collaborative. No one organization can impose a solution on its own in complex issues. You are going to be collaborative. There's no other way around it. 2, complex issues have systemic causes that keep the problem in place. There's a great phrase, programmatic interventions help people beat the odds, systems change interventions change their odds. Right? If we are in the game of solving complex issues, we are in the game of systems change. We have to think systemically. You can start with the program like they did, right? But it's just an excuse to zoom out. So they zoomed out. We have to think systemically. If you're wondering about type 2 diabetes, I'm from around St. Paul and I just have a friend who's a doctor there telling me about type 2 diabetes in Saddle Lake, right? If you aren't being systemic about understanding the root causes of type 2 diabetes, what have to do about diet, colonialism, residential schools, etc., you're not going to solve it with the program. Right? So think systemic. The causes are separated by time and space. And the third principle is experimental and adaptive. We experiment. We find out what works. Small bets before big bets. Ben probably used that phrase yesterday. Small bets before big bets to find out what doesn't work. If it works, bet bigger. If it doesn't work, no more betting. Go try something else. And here's the great thing of this. It's not just experiment and find something and hold on to it. All solutions to complex issues, all of them, have what we would call a half-life or strategic decay. They work for a while and then they don't. So this idea that we busted our chops and we finally found a solution that works, you did for a while, but the context changes. So in Vancouver, they developed this whole program that worked up until 2010. And then Katie Lang rocked it on stage singing Hallelujah chorus on stage. It wasn't really her fault, but then the housing boom stopped, and that program that was built partly on construction companies providing preferred wages through the NGO sector, the nonprofit sector, that business went away. So what did they have to do? Start rebuilding. All solutions have a half-life. They work for a while, then they don't. Those three principles you can take to town. There's more than that. Participatory, collaborative, experimental, and systemic. Now, why did I tell you that story? Because as I share these two aids relatively quickly, just to give you a flavor of how you might use them, and again, you will be the judge about whether or not you use them. This is Brenda Zimmerman, who was the greatest teacher I've ever met. She taught at the University of York. She taught in the field of healthcare. She's got one of the best books on complexity ever written called Edgeware, Complexity Insights for Healthcare Practitioners. You can still buy it. And I asked her once when I was vice president of Tamarack, I said, Brenda, when people in communities are working on complex issues, they don't mind these stories, et cetera, but secretly they want a recipe. They want to go, yeah, that's good, but just show me how to do it, like paint by numbers, right? I don't got time to figure this out. And I said, so what do you do? Because on one hand, and she goes, well, there is no recipe for this. On one hand, you have one-size-fits-all recipes. On the other hand, you have chaos. You can't tell people anything. She goes, there's thankfully a middle ground. Here's what she does, and this is what we're doing. She frames the particular issue that people are dealing with, we're going to talk about too, in a way that sensitizes it and normalizes it. Here's a real challenge that you're facing in your community. Number two, she says, let's try and together find principles that offer insight about how we should think and act about this issue. And a principle says this is important, but it doesn't tell you how. Let me give you an example. What's a stop sign? Say, what's the practice of a stop sign? It's a rule. What do you do theoretically? Stop. What if you see a sign that says drive defensively? What's the practice? We don't know what it is, but what did it just tell you to do? It says pay attention, right? You pay attention to your context. It might mean it's snowing like crazy, start braking 30 meters before the stop sign, whatever, or school zone, or look for kids. You have to interpret what a principle means in practice. It takes some judgment, but it doesn't say, I can tell you what to do. It just says, I know you should be doing something. So principles can guide thinking and action. And then she says, in order to make it accessible, give people not tools, but aids for action, things they could use in their own context. They always have to adapt it, and maybe stories to liven it up. That provides coherency. Coherency is not consistency. It says it's not chaotic, it's not consistent recipe-like, but it's coherent in the middle. So what I wanted to do today for the rest of this is to give you two quick challenges and principles to deal with that. Actually, before I do that, just given the time, I'm going to ask you to just no, I'm going to continue. I realized I got to be done in 35 minutes. Okay, let's go with the first one, and then I'll get you in groups here. So the aid for action is called the Agreement Certainty Matrix. And why am I going to present this to you? Many people in communities fail to distinguish, to even know there's a difference between simple, complicated, and complex, right? They just think problem, challenge, thing to work on. And so what we need to do as change makers is to say, this is a challenge, but is it simple? And we just have to find the recipe. Or maybe it's complicated. Maybe we actually need some expertise here. Maybe we can't do it by ourselves. Is it complex, where we might have to be very experimental and systemic? And this is called situational leadership and appropriate response. Competence is having the skills, knowledge, and attitude to do something. Expertise is situational recognition and appropriate response, knowing when to do something and how. So tools aren't going to get us there if we don't have expertise. We need to be at a minimum in situations saying, what kind of challenge are we dealing with, and what's the appropriate response? Now I'm going to give you an example. So the aid for action, there's a lot of them. I'm going to use the Agreement Certainty Matrix, and I'm going to use a couple of examples around housing. But here's a couple of quotes. I'm just going to ring through these because people, who gets a bad feeling when they hear the word complexity? Some people like this? Okay, I love these quotes. I had fun putting them together, so I'm going to read them. Stop trying to change reality by attempting to eliminate complexity. For every complex problem, there's an answer that's clear, simple, and wrong. Some problems are so complex that you have to be highly intelligent and well-informed just to be undecided about them. Abandon the urge to simplify everything, to look for formulas and easy answers, and begin to think multidimensionally, to glory in the mystery and paradoxes of life, not to be dismayed by the multitude of causes and consequences that are inherent in each experience, to appreciate the fact that life and building your communities is complex. The capacity to tolerate complexity and welcome contradiction, not the need for simplicity and certainty, is the attribute of an explorer. Centuries ago, when some people suspended their search for absolute truth and began instead to ask how things work, modern science was born. Curiously, it is by abandoning the search for absolute truth that science has begun to make progress and opening the material universe to human exploration. So the idea is be curious, not certain. Finally, the last ones. These are my also favorite quotes. Any darn fool can make something simple. It takes a genius to make complex. It takes a genius to make something simple. What we need to do sometimes in community change efforts is not to be simplistic about that's the problem and here's the solution. Sometimes we have to complexify something for a while, right? That's getting your feet wet. Wrestling, you got to go, oh, we're going to try that. Well, that didn't work. Start surfacing how complex it is. Ooh, look at all those bound up stories in that woman's quote, right? Or the housing thing. You have to entangle, you have to immerse yourself in it. And then if you do enough homework and you play enough, you begin to see the elegant simplicity of some of these things on the other side, but you don't get that without doing the work. You can't do it in a boardroom. The boardroom is a very dangerous place to view complex problems. The field is much better. The last one, that's essentially explained that one. So here's the tool, and the tool is something that you can use as community animators and community builders when you see an issue and you could plot it, your issues along two different things. So I'm going to do it very quickly for you and then give you an example and an example where we didn't do it, and then I'm going to let you talk. So this is called the Agreement Certainty Matrix, and it says when you look at an issue, it has at least two dimensions, the dimension of certainty and the dimension of agreement. Certainty refers to the extent to which we say, I understand that challenge, that issue, you know, why people using opioids, for example. I understand the challenge, I know why, I know what the solution is, a solution, and I can predict with high degree certainty about what the outcomes will be if we do this. That's high certainty. If you say, I'm not even really sure what's going on, I don't know what the causes are, I'm really not sure where to start, even if I have some interventions and programs or stuff, I don't know what they're going to do. That's low certainty. Agreement is where the people who have to be involved in moving forward in this are on the same page or not. Do they see the issue the same? Do they understand the problem the same? Do they agree on the solution? I'm going to do this on some community stuff. You could do this around your family and picking supper. Like the ingredients for supper, that's a complex system in itself, a family. So here's what it is. When you have high certainty, we know how to get something done, and high agreement, no one's disagreeing about it, you have simple. What do? That's follow the recipe. Find the right recipe and follow it. This is the zone of best practice, everybody. This best practice that everyone loves, this is its zone. Find the right problem, find the issue, find the right thing, and implement the best practice with high fidelity, and you'll get a predictable outcome. Sadly, not a lot of things are truly best practice. Number two is complicated. Send a rocket to the moon. Everyone at NASA agrees we should send a rocket to the moon. We're just having a hard time, apparently, in the last 10 years doing it, right? Although apparently they're getting ready for another one. What do there? You get the experts. Put them in a room and let them experiment for a little bit. They'll find the answers, but you need experts. Anyone see Apollo 13, the movie? You know that one scene where they're lacking oxygen, like the spaceship is sort of drifting, and they go, we need to squeeze out 3 more hours of oxygen for these pilots. And then they come up with the duffel bag and they throw all the stuff on the table and they say, figure out how to get them more oxygen with these ingredients. Do you want to be in that room? I don't. Like, what would I do? Hey, anyone want coffee? Can I rub your shoulders? Like, so what you need experts sometimes. There's a zone, there's a space for experts. Socially complex issues. This is where what to do isn't a problem. We just can't get people to agree on it. They may not even agree it's a problem. Never mind, there's a solution. So where to put a safe injection site? We know what safe injection sites do and they don't do. Like roughly, right? It's harm reduction, et cetera, et cetera. We know what it does. So it's not a certainty issue. It's an agreement issue. And what do you do with that? You don't actually need to do more studies to move the needle on social issues. You have to find common ground, you have to compromise, and sometimes you even have to go toe-to-toe politically because there's differing worldviews about how to deal with it. Those things don't get solved with best practice. They don't get solved with experts. They get solved with communities trying to figure out how to work together. Almost done. Chaos. Chaos is where things are off the chart on certainty and they're off the chart on agreement. Haiti, after the earthquakes and the systems essentially collapsed in Haiti, that's chaotic. No one knows what's going on. What do? It's a different kind of leadership. You try and say what's going on, get as much information as possible. Start communicating out, stabilize the situation, and while you're stabilizing and taking the crisis down, you start thinking, how are we going to innovate so this doesn't happen again? Or our response is better. Right? That's leadership in crisis situations. So I was the head of a nonprofit childcare, I was on the board. The board I got on 2 weeks later, I found out we didn't have enough money to pay CRA, Canada Revenue Agency. Crisis. So what did we have to do? We had to raise some money, we had to phone CRA, please don't shut us down. Crisis management. And then we had to say, that ain't happening again, right? So how come it took so long for us to figure this out? We have something wrong with our financial controls. And our poor executive director, who, like most nonprofit childcares, really good at program directing, now has to administer a complex organization. That's not very fair, right? So we had to solve this problem in the long term. Now those are all nice, but here's the one in the middle. Raising kids, rebuilding communities. This is adaptive leadership, but we talked about it earlier. This requires experimental, be collaborative, and be systemic. And over time, solutions will emerge, and they'll work for a while, and then they won't, and you'll have to start all over. Now, why do I show you that? Lots of people, we're going to go over to you, now play with this. They look at a situation, and you don't have to use this all the time. You're a board, you're a team. You might say, let's deal with this issue. What parts of this issue are simple? And where could we start looking for best practices or recipes? What part of this issue are social? We're simply going to have to figure out a way to go forward together. What parts are we going to need some expertise in? What parts are chaotic? What parts are complex? And we're going to have to get experimental. Deloitte and Touche use this agreement certainty matrix to do an assessment of the mining industry. And here's what they found out. Most of the issues that affect the mining industry, and they're quite safety conscious actually, and that's one of the reasons Fort McMurray got off so easy. In terms of limited damage to personal well-being, that's a mining town. They're so freakishly focused. Anyone from Fort McMurray here? Sorry. I like focused on safety. Go to a meeting in downtown Calgary. You spend 10 minutes trying to figure out where the fire exit is and stuff like that. Like it's a safety culture. But here's what they said. Most of the issues are complex, but most of our interventions are in the simple, complicated zone, even though the responses should be complex. Our remaining agenda is dealing adaptively with complex issues. Now, the reason I want to say that this is important, because this is a sensitizing framework. It helps people say, oh, there is a difference between simple, complicated, and complex, and maybe we should adapt our responses. You see, we're starting to build the same narrative. If you don't do that, here's what might happen. You might look at a complex situation, and if you look at it politically, what do? You go, it's left-wing King Kong and right-wing Godzilla. You demonize each other. Polarization. What's the nature of the problem? The other person's a jerk. I'm overstating that. What if it's simple? You desperately look for best practices, hoping you'll find one, knowing that you don't even believe the next one that you're seeing. You go, I'm going to be disappointed, but I'm going to look at it anyways. Serial consumer of best practice. What if it's complicated? Bring in experts and you do continuous planning. Plan, shoot, don't shoot, don't shoot. Plan. And if you treat it as chaotic, you bring in a charismatic leader and hope that they can impose a solution and reduce the complexity. There's an experiment going down south of the border right now. Unfortunately, it's a live experiment, right? about imposing charismatic leaders, imposing solutions on complex issues, right? Walls will solve problems, etc. So we could go there. Now, here's the last little bit. Here's an example of South Africa. South Africa and Brazil in 1980s have the same HIV rate, have both sophisticated health infrastructures, both have an urban and rural split, both have racism. South Africa's is structural, Brazil's is cultural. They each approach the problem of HIV differently. One says it's a complicated problem, the healthcare system will solve it. The other one says it's a complex problem, we have to find a way out of it, and all hands on deck. Okay? See the different orientation? Worldview. They ask different questions. The healthcare system, the formal experts actually have a way of dealing with that, and it had to do with high-cost prescription drugs, where you much needed the infrastructure, the medical system to use these drugs because they were high-fidelity protocols. You didn't follow the protocols, the drug wouldn't work. So they went, this is expensive. We only have them such infrastructure. We are going to have to focus like crazy on prevention and awareness, but in the meantime, we're going to lose a generation of people. They made that call. That's a public policy document. And it makes sense, right? You just think, we only got this much money, start preventing. So Brazil said, we're not going to do that. Who are the unusual suspects that can expand our capacity beyond the health system? And one of them was the nuns. Now, I know that's a controversial thing, because the nuns always haven't been on the side of things that have worked out. But they were all over. There's a lot of religious infrastructure in Brazil, and they were actually everywhere, and they actually started doing prevention work, treatment work, etc. In fact, in healthcare in Brazil now, the code for dealing with complex things is, one of the first questions is, where are the nuns in this situation? Like metaphorically. Who are the people that we don't even think about that can help with this? They ask different things, they start breaking different rules and being experimental and participatory, but here are three things that stand out. What did they do that was systemic? They declared HIV a crisis, which allowed them to pave the way to produce generic drugs, reducing drug costs by almost 90%. They're still in the courts for this. They broke a systems rule. They said, I don't care, this is a crisis. We're producing generic drugs. They unleashed this infrastructure with nonprofit organizations, and they start doing participatory things like, even how do you talk about HIV and get a really macho culture, particularly with the guys, to start wearing appropriate safety gear, right? And they actually had pictures like, in fact, you can't see the top left, there's a good-looking guy on the top left covered with roses, and he's giving you his thing, wear protection. Right? So they did all these, and they actually did cartoons for people who are illiterate that showed them how to use the drugs, the generic drugs. Go to sleep, wake up in the morning, eat something before the drug, banana, milk, whatever, and then, show them in cartoons. Do you think there was a difference? So the reason I say this is not an intellectually pleasing exercise. The stakes are high, high, high. In this case, they're deadly high, the stakes. We shouldn't trivialize this. If issues are complex, we have to have the discipline to let go of our traditional, complicated, simple approaches. We have to be ready to say there is discipline in being participatory, in being systemic and experimental. That's not sloppy, that's discipline. That's effective in complex situations. Here's our chat. I spent a lot of time on that one. The next one's going to go relatively easy. This is a biggie. How do you sensitize and normalize complexity and introduce to people the possibility that we have to avoid cookie-cutter traditional responses, linear, plan the work, work the plan responses. This technique of putting a matrix up, the agreement matrix, which you have in your bag, and saying just plot things out and discuss where we think they are, is a tool to help do that. Here are your questions. Where and how might you use the agreement certainty matrix in your work? And you might say, not at all. And what questions emerge about its use for you? Have a go at that for 5 or 7 minutes, and then we're going to do a quick rundown on the last 8, okay? We're going to open it up for hearing about your questions shortly. So, some of you have heard this before. I apologize. I don't use this joke that much anymore, but I was in New Zealand a bunch of years ago, and they introduced me for a talk, and they didn't actually do a bio, they just said, let's tell Canadian jokes. And that was weird. What was really weird is they had a lot of jokes. So the best one I liked was, how do you get 100 Canadians out of the pool really fast? Like really fast. You just blow the whistle and say, hey guys, time to get out. So that's what New Zealanders think of us. Okay, thanks for coming out of the pool. Okay, so I'm going to go very briefly on this next one because it's actually written up quite definitively, and I just want to give you an animation or two about the next tool, Aid for Action. This is one tool, the Agreement Certainty Matrix. I would just say we've been using it for 10 or 15 years now, and I haven't chatted about it for a bunch of years, but I do think it's foundational. Here's another tool, the Strategy Continuum. I'm going to jump ahead here. So traditional understandings of strategy are plan the work and work the plan, right? Do very good high fidelity upfront research, develop a plan, and then implement it. Would you agree? That's what we think about it. Here's a couple of thoughts. Strategic thinking is not strategic planning. There's a difference between plan and strategy. So strategic thinking is you establish a general direction. A plan is you elaborate that direction into concrete actions. So strategic thinking is, hey, we're right by the Eskimos stadium here. I often think about what it would be like to work for the Edmonton Eskimos in the CFL where fewer and fewer people watch CFL, right? I just think, how would you do that? Like everyone's watching NFL, there's a million things to do now. You can't get 60,000 people in the stadium anymore. A direction is, we're really going to go after the high schools or the junior highs in Edmonton, et cetera, and really start mobilizing a base and do social media, et cetera. There's no plans there yet. That's the direction. The tactics of how to do that, that's more the planning side. Committing style of leadership. When you do strategy, strategic thinking, you're getting people saying, I like that. I get it in my bones. I know why we're going there. Strategic planning is more of a calculating style of leadership. Here's what we need to do to get there. Finally, strategic thinking is you take in lots of information and you're creative and intuitive and you synthesize lots. And planning is more analytical and you break it down into little pieces and chunks. Now this is important because Henry Mintzberg, who's the greatest guy on strategic planning, I think, in the world, one of the two, argues that planners and planning styles should be around the strategy making process, not running the strategy making process. And he further argues that how many times have you gone to a strategic plan session and you've got 2 days in a place and you come out and you go, this is kind of what we were doing already. There's not a lot of strategic thinking that went on because the emphasis was on hurry up and action on planning. So the reason I share this is there's a distinction between strategy, plans, and implementation. And as we're going to see right away, when you get into complex things, traditional breaks them up. Strategy, plan, implement. In complex things, those are so tightly bound together that it's hard to differentiate them. Now let me give you some examples. Here is something called the Strategy Continuum, and the only reason I did this is I wanted to normalize different ways of thinking about strategy and different ways of thinking about what's the right strategy at the right time. So when we have low certainty and low agreement, we don't really know what the challenge is or how to get there. We talked about that earlier. There is a case for something called Emergent Strategy. When we have high certainty and everyone's on the same page, we could probably go with traditional planning. It might be useful. There's also a space, like all the time, the hybrid or something in the middle ground, where you have enough sense of the general direction and how to go there, but you're not sure about the details. That's called umbrella strategy, because the details have to be worked out case by case or in different contexts, and you need to improvise and be flexible a bit. So the strategy is an umbrella framework more than anything. Now, I'm going to give you three quick examples of this. The first one is, who's from Calgary here? Okay, Calgary, Edmonton, Red Deer, Fort McMurray, we've all got 10-year plans to end homelessness. I think 10-year plans to end homelessness, particularly the one in Calgary, which I quite like in terms of its exemplar plan the work, work the plan modality. That plan, when 2008 was produced, it was a classic plan the work, work the plan. Based on the Housing First model, which I'm not going to go into, you look at that plan, it's a planner's dream. It's got targets and it's got directions and roles and responsibilities and funding. They laid it out. They planned the work and then they worked the plan. And they implemented, and they did pretty good implementation. And then every plan Everyone has a plan that really survives implementation. Or, I'm going to quote Mike Tyson, everyone's got a plan until they get in the ring and get punched in the head. Right? You go in there and then stuff starts happening. And if you overplan, you develop something called commitment bias. We spent so long on this plan, I don't care what's going on, we're implementing it. Right? That's commitment bias of the highest order. But what happens? They learned lots of stuff with these plans. The economy changed from 2008 to 2018. They didn't get the implementation dollars they thought they were going to get from the provincial government. They learned the limits of the housing first model. I think the housing first model's got tons of merits, but it ain't the only dimension to think about. So they swung for the fence on an imperfect, rigid plan. Now, it had some benefits because people like the stability of that and the predictability of that, but it's no wonder that by the end of 2016, in Calgary, the real drop was about 11%. That's progress on a complex issue, but all it says is this may not have been the only way to do planning. I actually celebrate the success, but it's not nearly enough. So that's detailed strategy, and when you see the aid for action, you've got different ways of thinking about detailed strategy, but the issue is use it when you've got high levels of certainty and high levels of agreement that this is what's going to help you make progress. I'm not going to go into this, it's on the sheet. It's got some pros and cons. Emergent strategy.
What is human-centered design and what?
We don't care. Okay. We do care. We don't have time though. Ben was talking yesterday about design approaches. Surrey was human-centered design, even though we didn't call it. There is a moment in time where strategy is emergent if you allow it to emerge through a process of trial and error. The strategy is to be experimental, systemic, and participatory, like Surrey, like what Ben was talking about. This is a strategy, and it's not content discipline, where's your plan? It's a process discipline. So if Ben were here, he'd be channeling, you better pay attention to users of services. There's a discipline in that. You better do ethnographic research, you better ideate, you better prototype. There's a discipline to that process, and there's lots of different emergent approaches where there's discipline involved in the process because the content will emerge over time. So Henry Mintzberg, who does a lot of stuff on strategy, he says when you look at most successful corporations, most of them were emergent strategy. Very few people started with a big plan and exploited it and had success. Their business emerged over a time by exploiting opportunities and finding out what they were good at. So I'm not going to go into that, except to add one other feature, then I'll do the last one and we'll open it up. Emergent strategy is good when people aren't even on the same page. And there's a great book called Collaborating with the Enemy by Adam Kahane. And he talks about something called stretch collaboration. In conventional collaboration, we focused on the good and the harmony of the whole. Let's everyone sing Kumbaya and get on the same page. In stretch collaboration on complex issues, he goes, you may not even get people to agree it's a problem. So how are you going to get on the same page? You're going to sit in the parking lot and not drive out until you all agree on where to go? How about just get out of the parking lot as a first step? Number two, agree on the problem and the solution. They say you better experiment your way through. If you don't agree, you can experiment your way through on little things. And finally, it says, in conventional collaboration, you're trying to change what other people are doing. In stretch collaboration, you'd say, I'm part of the problem, and I'm part of the solution, and I have to change too. Now, I'm not going into that too much, but I just want to highlight that that's another dimension of complex issues. We're not on the same page. So why would we spend all our time trying to develop a plan that we all agree with? What if we just agreed to start? I think opioids, a lot of the responses to opioids are kind of like that. I'm not going to show you this as an example, but there are multiple different ways of doing emergent strategy, and you'll see that in the aid for action. But again, the thing is, when we're not on the same page and we don't know what the solution is, we should use emergent. The last one is umbrella strategy. And umbrella strategy, again, is where you've got the container. You can work within the container. You can agree with, we're going to deal with the opioid crisis, and we agree that these 5 areas are critical. We need faster access. We need harm reduction, safe injection sites. We need education in schools. I'm making this up. It's not my expertise. But you'd say, these are the domains. Here's some of the principles, and here's our starting point projects. That's a framework. And we're going to start there, but we sure ain't going to end there. Now, you will see there's a bunch of different ways of dealing with this, including, and you'll see that's shared in the guide, using principle-based strategy, which I love. And if you invite me next year, I'll tell you a bit more about how people are using principles to guide collaborations and evaluating their fidelity to principles to make outcomes happen, and that's their strategy, principle-driven strategy. So, I'm going to finish here. Rather than go and ask you to ask questions about Aids for Action, we're going to open it up for just 2 minutes left, but I want to confirm that in this PowerPoint that you get, oops, I'm going the wrong way. If you're interested in more later on, there are 2 resources here that I think are terrific around further aids for action for complexity. One is called The Power of Liberating Structures. Who's used that one? Some of you, thank you. Good resource, lots of nice tools in there. The other one is A Guide to Collaborative Inquiry and Social Engagement by a group called SAS out of Carleton. It's excellent. They've got so many great tools in there. If you want to go beyond tools, there's some great books, Getting to Maybe, How the World Has Changed. Brenda Zimmerman's book, Edgeware, Lessons from Complexity Finds for Healthcare Leaders, is terrific. And by the way, they're going to get this PowerPoint, right? It'll be in their file. And Complexity and Community Change, Managing Adaptively to Improve Effectiveness. You Google all of those, they'll come up as PDFs. And finally, there's some great websites, Human-Centered Dynamics, Rio's Partners, and Cognitive Edge. That's my time. I'm at time. Thanks for being patient with me, giving you a lot of information. Not bad for a guy who just finished a workout and can't walk. I've channeled all my anxiety to talking. But maybe we could take a couple of questions or observations in the room, because here's my challenge to you. Embrace complexity, get people to acknowledge challenges, build principles for tackling those challenges, and use aids and stories to help you work in a collaborative way, a systemic way, and an experimental way. That's the only way we're going to move the needles on tough issues.
Great, thank you so much. Are there any questions for Mark?
One over here.
It sounds like I'm just learning about this stuff. It's quite new to me, but it's really interesting. It seems quite applicable to different scenarios, but I'm wondering if the models that you were showing us, if there's any limitations if you go into a different culture, and that was actually raised by one of the folks at the table here.
2 things, thank you for that. I want to confirm that whenever we use frameworks and models, there's a mathematician who says every model is inaccurate. Every framework, every theory, because it can handle the complexity of what we're dealing with. So models and frameworks reveal things and they distort things. So in fact, I'm going to quote Plato, there are more things dreamt of on heaven and earth than dreamt of in your philosophy. No matter how comprehensive you think you are about explaining something, we're missing something. So whatever I show, it isn't perfect. It reveals and it misses and it distorts. So we should be aware of that. Every model is like this. What do I see with this framework? What do I see with this framework? And cultural context matters a lot as well. So in Thailand, when this simple, complicated, complex thing was used, here's what they said. Raising kids is simple. You try and make a good soup. Like, that's complex. Like, that's hard, right? And so, yes, to your point, so hold these things lightly. They're just ways of thinking about the world, and you have to make them appropriate to your context. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. This has been really helpful. I'm wondering with the agreement certainty matrix, I can see using that with a group as you sort of tackle the complex problem. But I'm wondering from your experience, what happens when you take that and you go back to a group that believes they found the solution and you lay the solution into the matrix? Does it help them think bigger, broader, rethink their plan? Like, is that a good way to use that?
Awesome. I've never done it that way. Not because it shouldn't be done. It's a great idea. I wonder, like, what do you think might happen if they did? I never even thought about doing it that way. That's terrific.
So I have a group that's been working on tackling social isolation. That's kind of their key project right now. And so they have, as sometimes communities want to develop programs or think that there is a programmatic solution to this very complex problem. And I'm wondering if I took that back and helped them identify where their solutions fit, if they would see there's a big hole, maybe, I don't know, like that's what I'm trying to figure out is, that's
Yeah.
why I was asking if you've tried it that way.
I haven't, but I'm more than willing to try, because I think I want to maybe remind myself what I said at the beginning. When I'm downstream doing evaluations, often I'm surfacing upstream disagreements about the nature of the problem and the solution. So the lens with which people look at this, hey, how come the Energy Futures Lab didn't follow the original recipe and produce these projects on time? Because it, right? That's an upstream issue. I'm really going to try this, actually. I think it's a terrific idea. So you're just thinking of yet another application of the tool. Thank you.
We have time for one more question if anyone has anything more. Christina?
Hi. I have a question about, it's more advice.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're working in the context where project management and knowing how long things are going to take is critical for some people,
Yeah.
how do you use some of this? This is something I've struggled with. I completely buy in with what you're doing, try to
Yep.
do that. But I have my project manager on the side saying, this is taking 5 days, how many manpower, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
Advice, how to...
So I'm going to say 3 quick things. Number 1, I don't know if this term is familiar for you. A lot of the time when we're trying to manage adaptively, we have to manage up. We have to make sure the system in which we're working feels fed. Like you got to create a cocoon, right? The system only, my wife calls it feeding the beast. It's hungry, it wants things. You give it action requests, you give it certain kinds of projects, you're managing up to keep the heat away, and you cocoon space for people to work on the inside. So it's more of a principle, but you might say, let's use these traditional management tools, but we're gonna try Scrum methodology. Like, have you ever done the sprints with Scrums? You could say, we're gonna try that while you are keeping the system away. Also, sometimes traditional techniques, you can actually hide other techniques in there. So there's a quick little story from a friend from North Africa. There's someone who's smuggling something from one county to the next, and the border guard knows he's smuggling something, just knows it, but can never figure it out. Year after year, the smuggler, the wagon train, the donkey trains are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So he's successful and he can't find out what he's smuggling. The fellow retires, the border guard goes to see him and says, listen, I'm off the clock now. What were you smuggling? The guy goes, donkeys. Thank you for laughing at that one. So in some ways, if our systems don't allow for this, we have to work in imperfect conditions. We're doing a lot of donkey smuggling. And as long as we keep I'm going to get arrested here, aren't I? It's mostly coping. Finding a crack in the light and doing what you can do. We do what we can within the constraints in which we work, and all contexts are imperfect for this work. I happen to think I'm seeing more openings for adaptive work over time, so I say, let's get good at this, and more opportunities to make it happen are occurring, and then when the systems start really not to work, we'll at least be good at it. Yeah.
Excellent. That's all the time we have.
By the way,
Yes,
maybe
go ahead.
last thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is a resource here. Complexity and community change, managing adaptively to improve effectiveness. I actually wrote this with someone from the Aspen Institute in New York. It ain't perfect. Like I look back on it now and I go, oh, I would say this differently and do that differently. But that was our clumsy way of trying to answer your question, saying here's how we would cope in imperfect conditions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. I have a little gift for you. Without making it strange or creepy from Ben's, here is the gift, and thank you so very much. We really appreciate it, and you gave us some great food for thought and things for us to build on. The resources are inside your bag, the 2 that we were talking about and working through today. And if you have any, we will be sharing the PowerPoint and this video recording as well.